Hello, my name is Jonas Butler, and I'm a practicing mental health clinical therapist. And I wanted to take the time tonight to talk about something pretty important that I noticed popping up in interpersonal relationships between people I know personally and those that I work with, which can accurately be described as becoming weak and staying weak. Now, that comes off as a very broad and generic statement, so let me specify what I mean when I say that. Weakness in this context refers to the inability to do what is just or right for yourself and for others. And that can happen for a plethora of reasons, such as ignorance, cowardice, greed, pride, laziness, hidden intentions, or some combination of these factors. But the problem remains the same across the board, because if you're struggling with any one or multiple of these factors, then what happens is you have the same inability to be able to act in the ways we discussed prior. And that origin is the epicenter of how you become ineffective and weak. Now, this dynamic can become present in a host of different ways. But as I alluded to earlier, we're going to focus on how this takes manifest in the context of interpersonal relationships. And we'll start with identifying how you know this is happening. One of the most common traps I've witnessed people fall into in personal relationships has always been the desire to placate others while avoiding conflict, as this is easy to rationalize and can produce a satisfying result for both parties. Now, if you structure your relationships like this, that doesn't automatically mean you're going to succumb to weakness. It means you're putting yourself in a position for bad tendencies to get created. What does this mean? Well, let's start with one of the best examples that come to mind: a married couple, to illustrate how impactful and damaging that this can become over time. Let's say in this marriage you hear for years, "I don't like your friends. You need to lose weight. I need you to do A, B, and C, but first you have to do D." You get so used to placating them that as soon as you walk through the door, you know what their mood is going to be like and you know what they're going to want next. This type of relationship can go on for years until you realize you no longer have a sense of self, and your spouse has been deprived of the necessary pushback that was needed for the relationship to mature. Now, this all too common situation does a really good job of capturing true weakness, because both parties and the marriage are being truly hurt by this because of your inability to act in a just and righteous manner. And this can become really dangerous because, as I said before, you can find yourself in this situation for a variety of reasons. And that's why it's of primary importance to be conscientious of poor thinking health. Like, if you feel emotional pain all the time in a relationship with someone, then obviously something's wrong. But the pattern that I always notice is that there's a need to rationalize this by saying, "I don't want to cause anybody any trouble, I just want to be respectful of everybody." But this always ends up in facilitating the situations which cause you to feel pain, which nobody truly wants. And by the way, if you're feeling pain in a relationship all of the time, then that likely means that there's an element of it which you haven't identified as to why you're feeling that pain, or there's a problem there that you're unable to do anything about. And if that's true, then it's indicative of the problem that I've been speaking about in this video thus far. Now, I want to take a minute to talk about poor thinking health because this is at the nexus of this problem with weakness. Poor thinking health refers to your proclivity to act in ways which defend hidden desires and facilitate maladaptive behavior. It differs from unhealthy thinking patterns and cognitive dysfunction because its focus is on your preceding internal conditions, which facilitates maladaptive thought patterns and is often solidified through repeat experiences. Certain defense mechanisms also play a role in securing poor thinking health by insulating you from new approaches. This is apparent in the previous example, as one spouse tries to soothe new tensions not by working through it together, but rather by placating unreasonable expectations to avoid conflict entirely. Now again, there will be some obvious signs of weakness, like going back to the object of your pain, which may present as a cycle of maladaptive relationships which have similar components. Now, in the context of interpersonal weakness, this may look like choosing partners or friends that remind you of a toxic family dynamic, just for the sole fact that it feels familiar and may feel comfortable, and you may misconstrue that as feeling safe, which, understood correctly, should lead you to the realization that this is a maladaptive way to cope with your own problems, relate with others, and reflects unfulfilled hidden desires. But there will be less obvious signs as well, like saying things you know are wrong or doing things which make you uncomfortable. And if you find yourself doing that, then it's really important to acknowledge it quickly so that you can avoid getting trapped in these dynamics where it becomes a cycle and you just keep acting in those ways, and then you become weaker and more inefficient and you're unable to start being able to identify the problem. Now, this process almost never happens quickly, and preventing it is usually the best way to deal with it. So the question becomes, why are people like this? Well, therapists often have a saying that there are no coincidences, meaning that your disposition likely results from something, or in other words, there's a reason for the way that you act like this or become like this. And this is about when we start getting into the territory of unconscious desires, otherwise known as hidden drives, because if you can't understand why you're feeling this uneasy around people or exhibiting this type of behavior, then that means the part of you controlling it is hiding from you. Now, if this sounds like you may already understand that you have a pretty difficult problem to deal with, because the nature of interpersonal relationships is already very complicated, so trying to find the hidden drives underneath that for why you're acting this way may seem like an insurmountable task. But an inextricable part of therapy may offer you a solution to this problem, which is asking questions. Socratic questioning forms the fundamental basis of therapy. It's something so essential that it can't be considered the same practice without it. It's defined by asking thoughtful and open-ended questions with the goal of exploring abstract personal concepts like values, assumptions, and maybe where your predilections originate from, just to name a few. So using this as a psychological tool is perfect for a psychological problem. Now let's use the example of the doting spouse to see how Socratic questioning can work out pragmatically. If you ask yourself, why do I always feel uneasy in relationships, then you've already begun the process of Socratic questioning. But a more comprehensive engagement would follow more questions that flow from your answers. Like if your answer to the previous question is, because people make me uncomfortable, then the next question would be, why do people make me uncomfortable? And this can continue flowing and giving more insight with the more time you donate to this activity. There's serious value to engaging in this type of practice because you can come to an answer which is unique to your own position, and subsequently you can figure out how to navigate through strategies which would help you to really get to where you want to be if you can make an adequate value system. Which, pro tip, you can also accomplish through Socratic questioning. Now, thus far, I've been talking about weakness in the context of placating others, because that is the form in which I've seen it to be most pernicious. But there's many other ways that weakness can make itself manifest in interpersonal relationships, such as through aggressive behavior that might include volatility or deceit, but can also make itself present in depressive adaptations such as avoidance. Again, to put it succinctly, the problems that we're grappling with here don't necessarily have to do with the presentation themselves, but it has to do with the resounding consequence that happens that influences your interpersonal relationship and filters you from being able to do what is right and justified for your best interest and others. So in theory, this can take any form, but the consequences of your weakness are largely going to look the same. But what are these consequences? Well, what I find in personal experience and in the literature is that these behaviors and approaches have a tendency not to go away on their own, but actually to increase over time. And that's because these approaches like people-pleasing or volatility or anything else have a tendency to give short-term gain, meaning that you get the desired effect from the behavior as long as you do it in the short term. But the problem happens when you reach long-term relationships and the efficacy of your approach starts to wane because you reinforce this maladaptive style of communication as being normative. In other words, the more you engage in weak approaches, the more normal that becomes for you and the more expected that becomes from others, and you'll further cement yourself as being weak.